Hi, I'm Mark Snowden, the director for the Cincinnati Area Baptist Association, and today we're going to talk about race, specifically in the Cincinnati area, but in general, especially for how churches and how you as a follower of Jesus should respond to some of the issues, especially that have been not only in the news, but something that's pretty much an ongoing thing here in Cincinnati, all the way back in my research to 1834. So that is quite a ways. We've got some special guests that I want to introduce, and I'll start off by introducing Kirk Kirkland, that's going to be on this with me, pastor at Revive City Church here in Cincinnati over on the west side, Price Hill. And Kirk, I appreciate what you're doing with the North American Mission Board's Send City Missionary in the Dayton area, and I really do appreciate what you're doing. And if you wouldn't mind introducing our other two guests, I would appreciate that.
Sure. So I have two just panelists that I've invited, and Mark's allowed me to do that. One is Dr. Matthew Lyons, and we are acquainted through a conference, I believe is where we first made our connection. We have a similar background and connection, and so Dr. Lyons has received his doctorate from Southern Seminary, and we interact on a couple of different levels within partner churches and pastors we're mutual friends with, and we've participated in at least one panel, if not a couple of different panels. And so I would love for him in just a moment just to give a little bit more of his story and how it kind of collides with mine, and how God has worked in his life concerning the topic at hand. And then also, probably one of my most recent friends is Dr. Jeff Zurcker. We also have mutual friends through Jeff Arrington and the Arrington Foundation. And so Jeff Arrington made that connection for us, and then we just really kind of hit it off. And interesting enough, one of our first interactions was at a racial reconciliation march that some of the faith leaders in our area put on, Unified Cincy. And so that's when we first met in person, though we had talked over the phone. And our children go to the same school now, and we've worked together on some projects concerning diversity and equity and inclusion. And so again, I hope that Dr. Jeff will be able to tell just a little about his story. He recently moved back from Selma, Alabama. He can tell you how the Lord led him there in just pursuing, again, this idea of racial reconciliation. And I do want to just correct you slightly, Mark. I'm a CPC. I'm not a sin missionary. That would be Travis. And so I'm a CPC. And actually, I'm working in different parts of the state, not just in Dayton. And one of my unique opportunities is to try to catalyze works in African-American communities across the state. And you're muted, Mark. You got to unmute yourself.
No, that's okay. Thanks. Yeah, nothing like coughing and then forgetting to mute yourself. And I was just so intently listening to you in those descriptions as well. That's important. Matthew and Jeff, great to have you guys on. Kirk, thanks, man. Appreciate you doing this and helping me walk through some of the issues that we have. I think it's important. Guys, I'm going to start off with Matthew 6:8. Mankind, he has told each of you what is good and what it is the Lord requires of you, to act justly, to love faithfulness, and to walk humbly with your God. That's Micah 6:8. I also read in this morning in my devotions, I've been working through Acts and got to Acts chapter 13, where there was that church at Antioch, which was so multinational, multiracial in its composition, but yet they met together, they worshiped, they really were united, and they were even mission sending, which was so cool. And you compare that with the church in Jerusalem and how it was unified around probably those that were Hellenist Jews and Jews as well. But you have such a diversity between those two churches was really good. I know there's a difference in what we see today as biblical justice and mercy and what we see sometimes from what's in the world. Being like Jesus is something that we all want to do. And how do we do that when it comes to race? How can churches be involved, and what is the role of a church leader? This is being recorded specifically for pastors in the Cincinnati area. We're also doing that on December 2nd. And we're already thinking about Christmas, and we're talking about peace on earth. We want that. But yet this year we've had anything but peace. We've had COVID, but we've also had rioting in our streets. We've had destruction. We grieve over that. But what should be the role of our churches and pastors when it comes, and I'm not talking about just urban, but also suburban and also rural. If you guys can start picking that up and letting the dialogue flow, I look forward to seeing what the Lord's laid on your heart.
Yeah, I would love for Dr. Lyons just to kick that off, and then Jeff, after that, if you had any thoughts, and I'll kind of close up some thoughts after those guys.
Yeah, glad to be on here. So I came from a conservative Baptist background. My dad planted a church in Maryland. He was from Texas, but he planted a church in Maryland. So a little bit of cross-cultural missions work, he always told me. And so grew up in a small Baptist, very conservative church. And I guess the best way you could describe my relations sort of racially would be neutral, which means I knew Black people. We had some Black people in our church. We're near Baltimore, but there was nothing, there's no real relationships. There was no proactive work. And then about 5 years ago, I became the pastor of the church. And I stood up on the stage and I looked out across the audience and I realized that I was now the pastor of Black people, with the realization that I didn't know how to do that. And so God used that sort of really a slap in the face to push me into learning how to love and to pastor the people that were in my church, which was an opportunity for me, a unique opportunity. And so I think the first thing I did, I got a PhD in history from Southern Seminary, which means when we don't know something, the first thing we do is go buy a book or 5 books. So that's what I did, bought some books. But then I also started talking to the people in our church, and, the conversations after church where you stay for an hour talking to the back of the church. I started doing that every week with the minority people in our church. And over about 5 years, I've almost got to the point where I think I know something about it. So it's really a work in progress. But what I've realized as you pursue this work, you build new relationships, and you take one step and you meet somebody else coming the other way. And so that's how Kirk and I met. I think the first time we really interacted, I was giving a small group talk on education or something. I mentioned Christian schools and their racial issues, and Kirk was in the room at that. And that's kind of the first interaction. And he was like, "Oh, wow, someone brought that up." That's the first time I've heard anybody bring that up. And so we built a relationship there. And so that just kind of compounded over the years to where it's really become a pressing concern of mine to build the unity of the church around love. And that means including all Christians. And of course, that intersects with justice in broader society. But I think really the focus is we start with our own churches, and that sort of goes out into society.
Am I up, Kirk or Mark? Okay. Hey, it's great to be with you. My name's Jeff Zurcker, and I liked what Dr. Lyons said, especially about when you don't know what to do, you go buy a book or maybe 5. We just moved in a new home, and probably 5 out of every 6 boxes in the garage are books. I don't know where to put them, but I don't want to get rid of them, right? Because I'm going to need them someday. But in the last spring, 2019, my wife came to me. She said, "I really feel like the Lord would have us move." She meant physically. And I work with the Arrington Foundation, been doing that for a long time. It's great because we get to work with churches and ministries and individuals and schools, and most of them are faith-based. So I've had a chance to partner with a lot of ministries and ministers over the years. And oftentimes it's delivering finances or helping them grow their organization in a variety of means. But you know, and sometimes that's an interaction for a day. Sometimes it's an interaction for a week, different parts of the country, even international. And my wife just felt compelled. In fact, in talking to Jeff Harrington, his wife, Valerie, who grew up a missionary, to, hey, let's go and let's take our whole family. And I'll cut to the chase. We ended up in Selma, Alabama with a group called SCORE International, Sharing Christ, our Redeemer Enterprises. And we went down there to help SCORE broaden its base and network, and just to love, to be loved, to know, and to be known. It was so amazing. Every person, both believer and non-believer, black and white, that we met in Selma, like, what are you doing in Selma? Why did you guys move to Selma? Jesus, right? That was the true Sunday school answer. It was actually, and so you really opened the door to share, hey, we're not here with an agenda. We're here to learn, as Dr. Lyons says, and I said, we're here to learn, we're here to be in relationship, we're here to love. And you know, the secret sauce for us was this, and anybody can do it. First of all, be intentional about who you are. Be intentional about who you are, and then be intentional about where you are, right? So if we would have gone to Selma 15 years ago, that would have been a different mix for us, because God was developing us, you know, individually, as a family, et cetera. So we got to a point where we really had a heart for this, a heart for, and we didn't just go for reconciliation and unity ministry. We went to, you know, God allowed that and opened the doors in our culture and our society. You know, I've been on our heart for a long time here in Cincinnati. I've talked to people, shared with people, but he gave us that experience as well. But be intentional about who you are, and be intentional about where you are. And that can be anywhere in the country. And then, Mark, to your question, one thing, you know, that's been a powerful document in my life in a lot of ways over the last 18 months is Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail. And I just want to read you guys a snippet. You probably are familiar with this to some degree. And if you're not, I encourage you to get it and read it. And you know, we're not, and again, friends in Selma, you know, Dr. King did a lot of great things. He was not Jesus. He was not perfect. We know that. But man, that guy gave his life, right, for this. But he says this in the letter to ministers in Birmingham. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and all states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what's happening in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with a narrow and provincial outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. Again, that's not from the word, but that is from a man who lived by the word. And I loved, and Kirk and I were talking about this even this morning, the network of mutuality. The network of mutual, and we could say that as Americans, but especially as Christians, right? That is where God has us. We can go to the book, we can go to the manual and see that throughout his tapestry, the story of his people. But man, if we can live with that mindset, and we got to experience that mutuality in some really cool ways this past year, and we want to carry that forward, because it does. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly.
No, I think that's a huge issue. And what bothers me is so many times I'm guilty of individualism and saying I'm responsible for my own actions. And in that culture, we're actually seeing that from Dr. King, how that mutuality is tanked. So what do you say to people that saying, I'm not responsible for what happened in the past, I'm only responsible for my own actions?
Yeah, so, you know, Mark, I love this conversation, and I just want to say to all the pastors who are listening, thank you for showing the work and sowing seeds and supporting our association. Thank you for allowing us to become a part just a little while ago, a little over a year ago, to join the CABA network. And we're new to this network, and we're so thankful for that. And in a sense, though we're autonomous churches, we are interdependent. I mean, we are connected. And if you were to do, I mean, this is simple and pragmatic in a sense in this conversation, probably oversimplified. But if you just do a Google search of Revive City Church, If someone got on and Googled Revive City Church, it's not going to be too far down the line. They're going to see that we're connected to Cincinnati Area Baptist Association. So what I do, my posture in the community, my conversation, not only what I say, but my manner of life, it does reflect every pastor who's on this call. And I would say it's the same in the reverse. And so we are connected, and when we talk about justice, that's where we started this conversation. You know, that's a biblical mindset. It's Proverbs 11:1 says, dishonest scales are detestable to the Lord, but an accurate weight is his delight. Or you could say it this way, an unjust scale. And so God stands for justice. God is justice. And so I guess the question would be, how does justice, biblical justice, apply to what we're talking about? Does it apply to what we're talking about? And I would just see in the pattern of the New Testament, especially in the person of Jesus, he goes and he meets a woman, and this woman, she brings up the differences, the disparities. How are you, a Jew? Okay, now she's talking about an ethnic disparity. Talk to me, a woman, right? So there was this, the gender disparity, and then there was the Samaritan idea. There was this idea that the Jews and the Samaritans didn't get along with each other because the Samaritans and the Jews didn't have any dealings. And so society is just like that woman at the well. Society are seeing these differences, and they're asking for answers. And so, of course, Jesus addresses this woman. And what I feel like the reason why biblical justice matters is because of the Great Commission and the Great Command, that we are to love one another. Jesus hinged that command of loving one another. He hinged it and connected it to the greatest command, which is loving God. And then also he goes and says, go and make disciples of all nations. And so if the nations are asking and crying out for justice, if they don't even have a proper definition of justice, who better to give them that definition than we, the people of God, and to understand that there's a greater overarching purpose. So anyway, that's just a little bit of what I feel like, how God brings us together. So we're not disconnected. And then also why it matters. Why does biblical justice matter when we're talking about the issue of race?
You're on mute, Mark.
Sorry. Yeah, and especially when you're talking about something like critical race theory, which is being kicked around right now, that's devoid, I believe, of biblical responses. Do you guys want to talk about that? I don't know how, critical race theory is coming up in your world.
Well, I did, but I'll let somebody else address that in a moment. I did want to get to your point about individuality, right?
Okay,
because
sure. Yeah.
we do. I mean, a mentor of mine, a guy, Mike Kelly, has always said he does leadership training. He's got to work on yourself before you can work on anybody else, right? So there's a truth to, we've got to work on our heart. But, I love the imagery in the scripture of abounding, like an overflowing, like when the Lord's pouring into us or something that just fills us up, and we spill out and spill over. And so that would be my encouragement to each of us. And some dear friends in Selma, Malika Fortier and Aika Jackson and I started this little itty bitty thing called social righteousness. And it was just about how we as a society, believers especially, need to be righteous. So it's not just, it can't stop with us. We have to be beyond ourselves, but certainly it has to start with us and outflow from there. And I've learned so much from those ladies, and it's been a really awesome opportunity to be in relationship with them. There's it's the Selma Center for Nonviolence, Truth, and Reconciliation, and it follows the teachings and principles of Dr. King. It's not a faith-based necessarily, but all the people involved with it are Christians. So it's really a powerful institute. And, again, a lot of our training and development, learning, as Matthew said earlier, came through that aspect. But I'll let somebody else address CRT. I'll shut up here for a moment.
Well, he's tossing that to me because he knows it's a hot topic. It's a hot potato. Uh, well, CRT has come up in my ministry directly, partnering with other churches. It's a very big concern for a lot of people. And I think maybe being a church historian, I have a different perspective on it than many. So critical race theory was developed in the 80s with legal scholars. So as a church historian, anything that happened in my lifetime, I just almost always just toss it out because I'm young, and if it happened during my lifetime, I really don't think it's has the value of 2,000 years of church history. So maybe that's a little dismissive, but I do think we need some perspective on things. If something hasn't existed until 20, 30, 40 years ago, what's the church said about those subjects before that? And if we can go back before the world created something, because CRT is absolutely created by secular scholars, whatever value or it has, it's still it's driven by the secular world and academia. So we don't want to start there. We want to maybe evaluate it, but we want to start somewhere else. And so what church history can do is help us see how the church has responded to the same issues. And if they happen to align with something that was created by the secular world, great. Plunder the Egyptians. But we don't need to go to the world when we have something that's older. So when you look at the issues that CRT is addressing, legal issues, racial issues, what they call systemic injustice or systemic racism, a lot of those words were created recently. But we can go back into an older time and look at Christians dealing with the same problems and see what they say. And then when CRT comes up, honestly, I don't know if I've read any books concerning the issue. And many people would say that I've been influenced by it, but I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a sociologist. I'm a pastor and a historian. So what I've seen when you look at church history, so you go back to the civil rights era, and they're dealing with racial issues. And at that time, in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, the racial reconciliation moment, the racial justice moment is led by pastors.
Amen.
It's led by the church.
Amen.
That's a better place to start than the 80s when it's led by Columbia University or legal scholars. And of course, the reason for that is because the church abandoned it in a lot of ways in the 70s. But in the 60s, 50s, it's led by the church. And so I think that's why Dr. King is such a great example, because his motivation was love your neighbor as yourself.
That's right.
Follow the way of Christ. It can be contrasted to many other leaders, for instance, Malcolm X, who had a lot of truth, but he was motivated by a different framework. He was a Muslim, and so he can speak truth, of course. But what Dr. King can show us is how do we take the Bible and apply it to racial issues. And what he did was he said, love has to drive our efforts. But he also, we brought up before, we're interconnected. He said there are things that we are not individually accountable for. And he talked about, Christians in the North who weren't there in Selma. And so they would say, I'm against putting dogs on marchers. I'm against turning the hook. I didn't do that. But Dr. King would say, yes, but do you love those people?
Right.
And if you love those people, then it is your problem. You are responsible for them. And that's what the Bible says. The Bible says, bear one another's burdens. And so what Dr. King and what the civil rights leaders did, let's own our history in the sense of being Baptist. Dr. King was a Baptist. And he understood that Baptists that people have to stick together in the sense that Baptist churches understand with congregationalism. So he drew on his theological tradition to say that the burden of one Christian is the burden of all Christians. And so we often say, well, if I didn't do it, approve of it, or participate in it, then it's not my problem. And the Bible says the opposite. It says, if it's a brother's problem, it's your problem. So CRT is a distraction. Now you can say you can disagree on whose distraction it is, but it's saying this is the way to do things. And some Christians are saying, well, I reject critical race theory, therefore I reject mutuality. But the Bible teaches that what slave owners did to slaves who were Christians is now our responsibility, not because we're guilty of it. White guilt is a tool of Satan, but responsibility is a biblical tool. And when we see people hurting, especially Christians, the Bible calls us to bear their burdens. Go, step beside them, take the weight off of them, and necessarily put it on us. And that's what the church taught. Let me go back even further, because we have to get out of this moment. We're so caught up in the moment. We have to see what the church really believed. So I have found a quote from Basil the Great. Okay, so this guy was writing in like 370 AD, as far from critical race theory and America as you can get. But he was writing on social issues. In fact, the book I have is called Unsocial Justice. Now, he obviously did not mean that in the same way that MSNBC means it. But he said, and he's talking about the wealth disparity, he said, from those who previously held dominance, they received the ability to treat many others unjustly. They oppress those who remain unscathed through those who are already victims of injustice. As wickedness overflows, it gives them the opportunity to expand their power. Now, what we're being told is that language is CRT. But this is from almost 2,000 years ago. And he goes on, he says, what neighbor, what confidant, what friend is not swept away? Everything submits to its tyranny. Everything cowers to its dominance. And so what church history is teaching us is that the church from 1,700 years ago is saying there's a system that develops around evil, and that it spreads and it overflows, and neighbors are taken over and friends are taken over, and that people are oppressed, and that oppression grows and it helps oppress others. Don't let secular scholars and the news media and whoever take that away from us. That is our tradition. The biblical justice, caring for one another, bearing one another's burdens, fighting for against oppression, that's the church. That's always been our thing. Jesus said, I have come to let the prisoner free. That the Christian tradition is fight oppression through love.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, the reason it's the church is because it seems from scripture that it's God's fight. Who executes justice for the oppressed? Who gives food to the hungry? The Lord sets the prisoners free. That's Psalm 146:7. Proverbs 22:16. Whoever oppresses the poor to increase his own wealth or gives to the rich will only come to poverty. So I love Tony Evans in this. He speaks to this culture very well. And he says, God didn't come to take sides, he came to take over. And so we're not taking a side of critical race. We're not taking a side of social justice warriors. We're not taking a left or a right position. We're taking, this is what God says he's for, and what he is for is what we should be for. And that's why I would propose the church for 2,000 years has been about this business, as Dr. Lyons speaks of.
And to tag on to what both of you guys are saying, boy, you could talk about and Matthew did a great job of setting it up, but CRT and the nuances, complexities. There's an article, man, I'll try to find it and get it and share it with Kirk, and maybe you can share it with the group on, from a Christian perspective on CRT. I thought was really interesting and really, really solid. I do want to just add to this and really add to what you all both said. The church that we attended, one of the churches we attended was a Baptist church in Selma, Tabernacle Baptist Church. And it's famous for a lot of things, including hosting Dr. King and a lot of the movement starting in '63, the first mass meetings. But pastor there became a dear friend, Pastor Culliver, and he had a sermon series this summer called The Theology of the Movement. And just a couple, I love taking notes and love reading the notes again, but he started off on one of his messages out of Ephesians 4 saying this: we can't have a movement that honors God without first consulting God. We cannot have a movement that honors God without first consulting God. Back to what Matthew was saying, and this is a Christian responsibility, right? And then his next point, or a next point, was without theology, our passion will fizzle out. So where is God, and what is he saying to us in this type of work? So again, this was June 14th, okay? So 2 weeks after George Floyd, a lot of emotion, rightfully so, but he really dove into righteous indignation, passion, but it's all behind theology. And it's absolutely correct in the 50s and 60s that those movements, and Selma being a touchstone for those movements, they came out of the church. They came out of Tabernacle Baptist, all right? They came out of Brown Chapel, and that's where people emanated from and came back to and met, and you know, Christians were leading the charge. We would have liked to see more Caucasians, as has been noted, but nonetheless, the people of God starting it and leading it, and really enduring it, right? And just as Christians throughout time have endured things for the Lord. So we're called now, right, to endure it for one another, with one another, as has been said.
Okay, as churches, we have a responsibility. We understand that. What are some practical things our churches can do today to address racial injustice in the larger community, in the nation? What is their role? Do we see something on TV and jump at it? Do we spend time, have study groups on this and address it? What would you, we did in 2017 in this association, just for you guys to know, we did a white paper on a call for biblical justice. And there's a page of practical things that churches can do at the end of that. But I was just curious, I mean, I think at the heart of it, we have a discipleship problem in our churches, because we can see the riots thing kind of flare up, and we lament and we grieve. And I know Ken Slaughter, that's on the call, we went down and stood in front of the Abraham Lincoln statue. That was back in June, I believe. Yeah. And prayed. And, you know, I appreciated doing that, but one of the reasons it's December and I wanted to do this is I don't think this issue should go away. And I think it's times like now where churches need to be discipling. Do you guys have any suggestions on how churches can be able to train their people, be able to minister? And does it change whether it's rural, suburban, or urban?
Yeah, let me just start off and say I do agree, Mark, that this is a discipleship conversation. So, and the Great Command gives us that command to disciple to all nations. And so, regardless where you're watching this from, if you're watching it from suburban Cincinnati or even rural Cincinnati, we would agree that we cooperate together so that we can make disciples throughout all the nations. That includes downtown Cincinnati, Price Hill, Avondale, all of the above. So if we're looking at this from a missionary disciple-making strategy, for me, I would say start with what a missionary would start with. They're going to, before they even get to the mission field, they're going to study the culture. They're going to inform themselves. They're going to pray. They're going to ask to join in what God is already doing. And so I'll give you two practical things. If you want to learn about Cincinnati and race relations, there's a book that a reporter recently published, Across the Color Line, reporting 25 years in Black Cincinnati. That copy Mark has, I sent to him, and I appreciate him reading that. This is not a Christian book. This is a reporter who happens to be a believer, but he gives a reporter-esque type of approach. It starts
secular,
yeah, secular, right. It starts with a history of race relations in our city, as Mark mentioned, that starts in the early 1800s. And then it just speaks to very practically and I feel like in a digestible manner of these type things. So that would just be a student of our city, a student of culture. And then another book that Mark could talk more about, but Chris Beard gave me this copy. He wrote the book, and in the back, he has some very practical things of where we can begin as he began in 1993 or 1995 in this same journey. And I would just quickly say, and then let the smarter guys talk, that it starts in our home. So the famous quote from Dr. King is, the most segregated hour in America is Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. And my idea or my contribution to that quote would be, and the reason why that's the most segregated hour is because the next most segregated hour is Sunday night at 6 o'clock when people have dinner. And so if you'll start to reconcile your dinner table, we'll see reconciliation across the city.
I'm going next because you said smarter people, so we're gonna let Matthew handle that one. Amen, right? Amen. And Kirk, I remember when you first told me that, and that is so poignant and so powerful. That was our experience, and you talk about practicality. I don't know if it's Stephen Covey. It feels like it was he that said, "Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can." So somebody like that said that. So when you talk about rural, just educate yourself, as Matthew said, learn, but don't go make, we can talk about this in any type of spiritual aspect. Don't make people into projects, right? You don't just say, hey, I want to, but where is God allowing you in your space to operate? Whether that's in Selma, Alabama this past summer, and then the months before then, we were already operating in that space, right? So it was a natural outflow to continue to operate in that space in not a different time, but a different understanding of the time we were in after Memorial Day weekend this past year. But I think the two things that occur to me is authenticity and humility. Humility to know, man, I don't know what to realize there's a lot I don't know, and to learn, to educate yourself, to be in relationship, to sit and listen with other people, right? And to do that humbly and saying, man, I need to grow. And maybe there's not hate in your heart, but there could be ignorance, right? And not understanding things. And then authenticity goes, that's a bedfellow of humility. Bringing your whole full authentic self to the situation. Again, this is things I've learned from my friend Ainka. Bring your full authentic self and say, I struggle. I'm a work in progress. I'm being sanctified. But what type of authentic relationships can you have with people where you can say, man, I didn't know that, or man, did you know that about me? Again, it doesn't have to be highbrow at all. In fact, it shouldn't be. It should be, ground level, grassroots. But seek out authentic relationships that naturally occur. Don't make them projects. And Kirk said it well. And we had a lady to our home who was a dear friend of ours in Selma, who did some ministry with, and she was, a little bit older than us, but she said, I'd never been in a white person's home. And where we from in Mason and our relationships, like we found that hard to believe at first, but then we realized it's a common story in different parts of our country, Selma maybe being one of those. So again, you don't want to try for quotas or anything like that, but do be authentic and do be intentional. And the Lord gave me an acronym a number of years ago, and we saw it kind of play out in Selma, not just with us, but with others that we got to be in relationship with. One of the best leaders and servants I know, Pastor John Grayson, learned a lot from him, but in seeing this acronym come into play, love, labor, oneness, vision, and equipping. Labor, oneness, vision. Can we work together? It's not just talk, it's work, it's effort, right? Are we really working and wanting to be unified? Not uniformity, but unity. There's a big difference. What's the vision for change? What's God's vision really for unity in his body and beyond? And what are we doing to help those come alongside us and for ourselves to be equipped? And that's the purpose of this call, which is awesome. I'm glad you guys are organizing. Thank you for letting us be a part and sharing just a little bit of our story. And now we'll turn it over to the smarter one, Dr. Lyons. See, when I just grabbed that from you, so I stuck it to you a little bit there.
Yeah, the problem with being called the smartest one is that you've got to show up and prove it. So I'm not the smartest person. No, practical stuff, and especially talking to pastors. Both of you guys, the relationships, what we're talking about is a lifestyle. It's not a weekend event that you go to a conference and you're done. It's changing your life. It's what it means to follow Christ. He didn't say, come to a conference where Christ is speaking. He said, walk, follow. And so it's this lifestyle. So what's helped me in a pastoral sense is I preached verse by verse through the book of Exodus. And what I found in the book of Exodus is that God lays out his vision of social justice. What I mean by social justice is the way God wants society to run. And the book of Exodus is not wisdom, it's not principles, it's law, which means when God set up his own country, which had ethnic problems, from day one, they had ethnic problems, they had social problems, they had national problems, they had all sorts of problems that we have. He said, here's the laws, here's the biblical godly law to address social issues. So when you preach verse by verse through Genesis, which may not be familiar, many people don't preach verse by verse. It takes a lot of work. It takes a long time. It took me about a year to get through the whole book. But what you do is you immerse yourself into God's law, God's view of justice, week after week after week. And you realize that God has a lot to say about the stuff that we're talking about. He talks about how to treat people economically. He talks about how to treat people socially. He talks about systemic issues and about mutuality, about individualism. So if you preach week by week through Exodus, you're going to see God's view of justice applied to a country, to a people. And then what we're doing is we're being discipled by the media. And it's become so apparent this year, talking to church members. Every one of our church members is being discipled probably daily from either Facebook, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, whatever it is. They're being discipled. They're being told how to think. And that's going to happen. We can't change that. That's the world we live in. So we have to counter that with what God thinks. And so Exodus is a best place to start with that. And then what I did after Exodus is I went to the minor prophets. And I think I went through Amos and Malachi. And what those are, it's saying, here's how you've messed up practically. And what the minor prophets do is they say, here's the history of Israel. Here's the things you're not doing in society, and here's how you're vindicating yourself practically. And then he confronts those. And so what the minor prophets do is it's the most practical kind of preaching. And when you look at the civil rights movement, you see them drawing from the minor prophets. And so when you do that kind of verse by verse preaching through these two books, you give people the foundation to think biblically about justice. Now, of course, in Exodus or Malachi, it's not talking about how we should respond to police brutality in Cincinnati. But brutality and violence by people in charge over people under them is not an American thing. The Bible deals with that. So starting with the Bible, practically preaching and teaching through those two specific areas. And then one of the problems in America is that legal segregation ended in 68. And as a result, people had to sort of segregate themselves voluntarily, which most of us, maybe all of us, had no part in. But if your grandparents and parents remove themselves from other people, you were born into a world where you're separated too. So we may not choose segregation, but we are segregated. And so the only way to fix that is to intentionally put yourselves into places where you are not the majority. When we go to our churches, we fit into our churches. It's just normal. It's the way we were raised. It's what we're comfortable with. And as a result, our churches are predominantly like us. And if you're white, they're predominantly white. And that will never change on its own. We have to intentionally Google, and this is what I did. I Googled Black churches in my area, right? Like the most blunt, non-technical way, non-biblical way of finding relationships, because that's how segregated I was. And so unless we step forward into being uncomfortable, we're going to be stuck. And so you have to say, what are the churches around me that aren't like me? And then go to their services, go to their conferences, go into their spaces humbly, because that's what the Bible says. We must do justly, but walk humbly before the Lord, and say, things are not right in America, and I don't want to be a part of that anymore. So let me go to where I'm not comfortable. Because here's the thing, I was just talking about this with some Black church members. They said to me, Black people aren't comfortable either, but we're not comfortable at Walmart. We're not comfortable at school. We're not comfortable at church. We're always the minority. So what we have to do is we have to bear those burdens and step into places where we're not comfortable. And what I found, to both my delight and shame, is that in churches that I visited in Atlanta, Chicago, Salt Lake City, Black churches are the most welcoming churches I've ever been in.
Amen. Yes.
Which is scary. Like, let's be honest, we are uncomfortable as white people going into a Black church because we're like, they don't want us there. That's what we are told. That's what we feel. But let me just try to help. They are the most welcoming, which when you go there, you realize, wow, Christians love each other. And there's also some shame there thinking like, why did I think that? Why did I assume that they weren't going to welcome me in? I've gotten more hugs at Black churches than I ever got in my own church. That's just the culture that's been built there. So we have to overcome that barrier, not by waiting for people to come to us, but by doing the Christian thing like Jesus did and going to them. I mean, this is Christmas. Christmas is all about Jesus leaving his comfortable place in heaven and going to people because they would never go to him. So we've got to step out into being uncomfortable, putting ourselves into positions where we are not in the majority, and then realizing how much we have to learn in those spaces.
Thank you. That's good. Any other points on this?
Well,
yeah.
just one thing, and to tag on to what Matthew said, and I was had the opportunity and the blessing to share this in a few different churches in Selma, but when we have the sameness, I should have had a chance to share this at Revive too, the sameness, our differences can not only be recognized, but celebrated. And I would submit to us that we do have the sameness in this word, this Abba, this Father, right? We have the sameness. So our differences not only recognize, oh, you're different from me, but also saying, thank you, Lord, for doing that. Thank you in your sovereignty and your beauty and your provision. And I love, and I've had a lot of conversations on this chapter this past year, but I love 2 Corinthians 5 and 1 Corinthians 12 have been two powerful chapters in my life this last year and even before that. But verse number 18 of 1 Corinthians 12 says, but now God, talking about the body, has set members, each one of them in the body, just as he pleased. Like it was his pleasure and prerogative to make us different. And the enemy tries to use those differences to divide, but if we can recognize and really appreciate and pursue and say we have that sameness where our differences can not only be recognized but celebrated. One quick anecdote with this: we were in a church in Selma that a friend of ours was a deaconess at, and my wife couldn't go because the kids were sick, and I went in there and came around and sat in the front row or fourth row because I came in a little late, and a lady came and brought a visitor's card and put a visitor's card in my, like over my shoulder in my lap. And I just laughed. We smiled at each other. I said, is it that obvious? Right? Because I was the only white guy in the church, but we laughed. It was fun. It was great. And it was amazing service. I got good notes from that one too. And, we celebrated those differences because that the kingdom, bring the kingdom of heaven down to earth, as many of us have been talking about for a long time, but especially in these past months. Like, what is heaven going to look like? And can we do that in the local bodies? And maybe we can get there in some areas, maybe we can't in others, but doesn't mean we shouldn't have the heart for it nonetheless.
Love that.
So that would be my time to say I'd love to have anybody come to Revive City Church and be our guest. I'll honor you, and you can get some of those hugs.
I enjoyed my time at Revive City. I look forward to going back. That's really cool. Hey, Kirk, do we need to have just a lightning round on some of the issues? I know you and I had talked about symbolism that is out there. Some of the symbols of hate, but others see it as history. And you want to take that on just real quick? We'll do a lightning round on maybe some of these issues.
Let me just frame up the conversation, and I'll pitch it.
Yeah.
Let's start with Black Lives Matter. Let's start with that before we go to the Confederate flag or Confederate monuments.
Okay.
I've faced this in our Christian school. We had a situation where the kids wanted to do a fundraiser, and they wanted the proceeds to go to Black Lives Matter. And someone asked me to weigh in on that. Will this Christian school with these Christian principles give money, allow a fundraiser to happen to give to Black Lives Matter? And I just want our pastors to know, when you hear Black Lives Matter, that has been politicized. It's been racially charged. It really, honestly, I believe that phrase has been hijacked. And I want you to know, when the average person at Revive City Church hears Black Lives Matter, they don't think about an organization with a website with a manifesto or a mission statement. They don't think about some type of organized entity that you give a donation to. What they think about is what this movement, almost like the sermon of the title of the sermon Jeff mentioned. It's an idea of my son, my daughter, having a fair opportunity when they engage people with the ability to take their life with immunity, you know. And we want to be treated in a way that there's complete equality. And even if there is a 0.5% more likelihood for me to get shot because of the color of my skin, that is an unjust balance. And when that's what the average person at Revive City Church, when they hear Black Lives Matter, that's what they think. They don't think of some organization that wants to bring about a fundamental change to our society from the standpoint of heterosexual, homosexual, or, you know, any of those type things. They just think about their kids making it to the next day and having fair opportunity. The reason why I believe Black Lives Matter, the organization that exists, is because there has been a vacuum where Black Lives Matter of the 60s was the local church. It was Tabernacle. It was these churches that Jeff talked about, and other churches and other leaders, not just Black, but the Black Lives Matters of the 1860s were abolitionists. And so where we don't have the church entering into this space in mass volume in our current climate, then the world, the secular society, entered into that space. And there's a huge discipleship disconnect with millennials and Generation Z in the African-American communities, where they're not going to the church and they don't see the church as the center of their life or thought leaders. And so that's why you see this emergence of a secular organization being the thought leaders for racial equality. And so I would say the church can claim the stake in the ground that we already have had, again, throughout history. And we don't have to enter into something that would compromise who we are, what we believe. And so, again, I just feel like Black Lives Matter, that phrase, you know, has been hyper politicized and almost dismissed, when really I want you to hear the heart behind what it really means. And then, so, you know, I spent 5 years in the South studying for ministry, and I'm very familiar from a standpoint of what it means to grow up in the South and have a sense of pride for your heritage. And I would love to hear Matt's, you know, commentary on whiteness and how that has played into this racialized society. Because I think when we detach ourselves from our ethnicity, our true ethnicity, meaning our nationalities, that's where we've come into these problems. So if you had an Irish Pride Month, no one would have a problem with that. If you had a German Pride celebration, everyone would be okay with that. And there's neighborhoods you can go to that are German, Irish neighborhoods, and you'll see Irish flags being flown. You'll see German flags being flown, Croatian, whatever, Eastern Slovakian. No one is going to say, look at that hate. No, they're going to say, oh, they're just celebrating their nationality. And I think again, let me pitch it to Dr. Lyons to say, talk to us about the difference between celebrating a nationality and a culture and a heritage with celebrating whiteness, which is something different, I believe.
Yeah, this is really tough because When you say white, we feel attacked because we're white. And so like, oh, there's something wrong with the way that I was made by God. That's the first reaction. God made my skin. I didn't pick my skin, which kind of gives a hint into how black people felt for 400 years. But whiteness and the symbols behind it are not in reference to the body that God gave us. They're not in reference to the family and the blood that God gave us. They're not even really in reference to the countries where we're from, which I believe God had a part in that too. Whiteness was created in the modern era to justify a way of thinking and a way of doing things. So when you are Irish, you have Irish pride, which means you have pride in the country where you were born, raised, the culture you grew up in. It was your family. Whiteness did not arise out of your hometown having feast on Fridays, and that became part of your culture. Whiteness arose in the 1600s when the governments of Europe wanted to promote economic exploitation of Africa. So they wanted to create slavery, or they didn't want to create slavery. They wanted to use slavery to build their empires. Well, in order for Christians, which they call themselves, to feel okay about enslaving people, they had to find some justification for enslaving Africans, but not enslaving people in London. So the justification was not, it wasn't just we don't care, because they knew Christians weren't supposed to say that. They said because of their skin color, their blackness, we are okay to enslave them, which means that our whiteness, our skin color, which no one had identified with, no one ever identified as white before the 1500s. They always identified as Irish, as European, or as whatever country, Italian. But in the 1600s, they said, no, now we are white, and white is better, so that we can exploit economically people who are black. So whiteness and blackness were created as an economic tool of exploitation. And when it comes to America, you really see it get put into laws where Christianity was subjected to whiteness. So when you showed up in America in, say, 1700, there were laws that said if you had white skin, you could not be a slave. If you were white, you couldn't be a slave. If you were black, you could always be a slave. So you're Irish and you're very proud of your Irish tradition. You never cared about your skin color because you never thought about it. You show up into America and they have a registration form and there's only two boxes, white and black. There's no Irish box. So you say, well, I'm Irish. And they said, well, there's only white or black. Which one are you? Well, of course, you're going to choose the one that gives you the most privilege, the most power. You're not going to choose black because you can be made a slave. So every ethnicity that came to America chose to give up their Irishness, their Croatianness, and choose to become white so that they could have a place of power in America. And so their ethnicity was erased. So instead of flying the Croatian flag, they now just fly the white flag, as it were. Okay, so when the Civil War shows up, that's where we connect it to the Confederate flag. The Civil War was, whatever you feel about the Civil War, and I grew up, I was a son of the Confederacy. We flew the Confederate flag in our church. Like, wow. I grew up, man, my dad had hundreds of books on the Civil War. So I grew up deep in that culture of heritage, not hate. This is our identity, Southern pride, the South's gonna rise again, no land like Dixie, like all that stuff. But that's not what the Civil War was about. That was created after the Civil War, that narrative. And you can argue what the Civil War was about, but at least part of it was about slavery, was about the right to own people against their will. Every Southerner believed that. Okay, so then the Civil War ends, the South loses, and now you have emancipation. The Confederate flag wasn't the symbol at that point. It was a battle flag that wasn't widely used. But later in history, you had a resurgence of white nationalism. The Ku Klux Klan arises right after the Civil War, but then it goes away. But then it comes back in the 20s. That's where you see the monuments going up in the 20s, 30s, because there's pressure from immigrants and there's pressure from Catholics. Then you see the Confederate flag come up again, symbolizing whiteness, not symbolizing Southernness, because black people didn't fly the Southern flag, the Confederate flag in the South, but they were Southern. but you didn't see them flying it. So the Confederate flag became a symbol of whiteness. Now, I got into a big argument at Southern Seminary from the wrong side, in my opinion, arguing for the Confederate flag as a symbol of history. And my professor very gently said to me, what about the Black Christians who feel like it's a symbol of hate? Don't you care about them? And to my shame, I basically said, no, the truth is more important. So when we discuss this, the basic answer is, if your Christian brothers and sisters see the Confederate flag as a symbol of hate, there's no more to talk about. There's a history that we can discuss understanding it, but if your Christian brothers who are Black see the Confederate symbol as a symbol of hate, the only answer is that we get rid of it. That's it. As a sign that we love them and we bear their burdens, and that we weep when they weep and we rejoice when they rejoice. And if they see it and there is some sort of otherness there, we remove barriers. So I think on the one side, there's the history that the Confederate flag does not represent Southern heritage. It represents white heritage. But more importantly, to Black Christians, and I think they're right, but it really doesn't matter when we're talking about love, it represents that they're not as good as everyone else. And so, and that would be my same thing with Black Lives Matters. It's the same thing. It's the opposite of that. It's saying Black people do matter. I wear a Black Lives Matter face mask sometimes, and I've had multiple just regular Black people working at Sam's Club just say, thank you for wearing that. And I thought, it doesn't cost me very much. But what they were saying was, thank you for recognizing that I am an equal person. They did not think I was a Marxist trying to dismantle the nuclear family. They wouldn't even recognize those terms. They just said, you care about me. And I think that's what we were going for.
And let me follow that up just a little bit, Jeff. I don't know if you have a follow-up. Someone would then say, well, then why do we have Black History Month? Why do we have the BET, or the Black Entertainment, channel? Why, if we can't celebrate whiteness, why are they celebrating Blackness? And I would quickly say, I would love, and I'm going to get a tear in my eye here, I would love to know my nation of origin. I would love to know where my people come from and where my dad's family comes from. We're studying this for our children, and we fill out the census. And I can tell you about my mom's grandparents who came from Ireland when they immigrated. We can find their name on Ellis Island. I cannot do that on my dad's side of the family. And I'm not saying any of us on this call or listening to this call is responsible for that, but let's not treat history as a vacuum, as if it doesn't affect what happens currently, meaning I don't know, and I've been disconnected with my ethnicity. So people have connected under Blackness because they had to, not because they were using it for a power. It wasn't a way to oppress people. It was a way to what any of us would do in celebrating our history or nationality. And that is why, by the way, where some people may see things as isolated incidents, why are we talking about what happened in Wisconsin or in Minneapolis, or what happens in Georgia? Why is this being reported as national news? These are local events. To the Black community, they're not local events. It's a very communal society. And so, and that's why Black comedians are so celebrated and have such a following. It's because they speak to Black issues, and they're pulling people from all over the country, yet they're laughing at the same things, because it's a very communal life, because it's much more closely connected to a ethnic background, because we don't know, by and large, our ethnicity. We don't know what country of origin that we have to be able to celebrate. And so that's why I don't think it's the same thing when you celebrate Black history or to talk about some type of white pride or white nationalism. My 2 cents, and I'm
no, it's good.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
Not the Bible, just my opinion.
No, that's important. It's out of your experience, and I really do appreciate you talking about the ethnicity differences there. Guys, we've got just a couple of minutes left. Do you have any closing thoughts, any final challenges that you'd like to include, just in 30 seconds each?
Yeah, I'll kick off because it kind of dovetails into what both Matthew and Kirk said. And even Ken, your note from Cain was the first person to say he was not his brother's keeper, right? Pass the buck. You know, dovetailing with the Confederate flag issue this summer, with all the things going on, us being in Selma, God really kind of opened up some creative writing, poetry. I've got a background in that. I remember writing a poem, and part of it was that true love is really not knowing what causes or gives somebody pleasure. It's really becoming intimate with what causes somebody pain, right? With knowing and feeling their pain. Can we get there? Jesus did that for us, as we talked about, as we see in the scriptures in Hebrews and other places, right? So can we really get to a point where we can appreciate and share that pain? Because when the pain threshold is such, that really facilitates change. So can we do that as a collective body? And you know, again, that's through authentic relationships, getting to know people, knowing what causes them pain, and you know, becoming all things to all people. I mean, we're taught to bear one another's burdens, and are we willing to do that and to sacrifice some of our individuality, as we talked about earlier, to do that?
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Let me do the next one, Matt, then you close it out. One thing I just wanted to say, I know we used the word privilege a couple of times, and that also is a hot button term. And I do not want to dismiss the struggle of any people group, any people who grew up poor, people who grew up in poverty. And so when I use the word privilege, I don't mean it to dismiss the struggle of white people. I just mean it to try to articulate the experience of Black people. And meaning that I think white privilege would be of all the different things that hold you back in life, color is not one of them, is the way I would define that. And so again, I would love to have coffee, have someone over to our church, connect offline. If someone hears something and they have questions or concerns or issues, man, I'm a real guy. Call me on the phone, let's talk. And I would love to make a connection that way. And thank you, Mark, for the opportunity.
Oh, that's awesome, Kirk. That's cool. Nice offer. Matthew, Dr. Lyon, what you got?
Yeah. Again, Galatians 6:2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And in the very next verse, for if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. We reach out, we bear one of those burdens, but let's not pretend that because we watch the news that we have any clue what's going on with the Black community. Because we went to some school that we know anything about what's happened in the past. So the Christian responsibility is to bear one of those burdens as if they were our own, and always recognize that we are limited and we probably don't even know what we don't know. And so we walk humbly before the Lord, and we don't get defensive when we're confronted. We seek out relationships, we seek out to care for people, and we always assume that we could be taught by the other person.
Thank you. We want to close out this. I want to point to one resource that the Cincinnati Area Baptist have that is holding up well, and it's a call for biblical justice. It's at cincinnatibaptist.com. Take a look at this 11-page paper. It's a 10-page paper with 1 page of suggestions. I want to close with a quote from that talks about a characteristic of God is doing what is right and making sure it comes to pass. And I think that's a strong point to end on. Thank you guys today. Kirk, Jeff, Matt, Ken, thanks for hanging around. Charity, we appreciate you guys very much, and we'll be uploading this soon. Thank you. Let me stop.